The first thing that went wrong was the sound. Not the gunfire. Gunfire was expected. It was the sudden absence of everything else, the way the jungle seemed to inhale and hold it, as if the canopy itself had decided to listen. The platoon had been moving in a staggered file along a muddy elephant trail, boots sliding on roots, sweat turning their uniforms into dark, heavy cloth. It was late afternoon in 1969, the kind of hour when the light starts to flatten and every shadow feels like it's hiding something with intent. They had been inserted by Huey 2 ridgelines back and told the same lie every unit learned to distrust. Quick sweep, check a suspected supply corridor, then pull out before night swallowed the map. The lieutenant, a young West Point type named Arnett, kept glancing at his compass like it could reassure him. The men kept scanning the green wall to either side because the jungle never stopped watching. Specialist Eli Mercer walked near the back, not by choice, and not by some tactical plan. He was there because the platoon had quietly agreed he belonged there. Mercer wasn't the strong one, wasn't the loud one, wasn't the cool one. He was 26, old for a draftee, thin in the shoulders with a cough that never seemed to leave and a shy, guarded way of speaking like every sentence had to pass through a checkpoint. He'd come from a stateside motor pool and ended up in country as a replacement, then got pushed into line infantry when a company took losses and needed bodies more than resumes. The first week, he'd been sick from the heat and got labeled weak. The second week, he'd fumbled a magazine change during a range day and got labeled useless. The third week, when the platoon moved under mortars and Mercer froze for half a second too long before diving into a bomb crater, someone said it out loud, "That guy's gonna get somebody killed." After that, Mercer became a kind of negative charm they all carried, proof that the army didn't always send what you needed. He did the jobs nobody wanted without complaining. Extra batteries, extra water, dragging the radio spare, carrying the Claymore bag, cleaning the M60 when the gunner's hands were shaking. He carried an old beat-up M16A1 that had been swapped and re-swapped through too many hands, the kind of rifle that looked fine until you needed it to be perfect. The squad joked about it the way men joke about anything that scares them. If you laugh at it, maybe it can't hurt you. That afternoon, when the jungle went quiet, Mercer felt his stomach tighten before any shots cracked, because he'd started trusting instincts more than briefings. Then the ambush opened like a trap door. A burst of automatic fire tore through the brush from high right, not a spray but a controlled lane that pinned the head of the column instantly. Another weapon opened from the left, lower, stitching just above the ground where men were trying to crawl. Somebody up front screamed, "Contact!" as if the word itself could explain the shape of the danger. Several men went down in the first seconds, not dead, not yet, but hit and shocked and suddenly heavy in the mud. Lieutenant Arnett tried to shout orders, tried to make the platoon into a diagram from a manual, but the jungle made a mockery of clean lines. A grenade popped somewhere ahead, the dull thump swallowed by leaves and distance, and Mercer felt the concussion in his chest more than his ears. The smoke that followed wasn't dramatic. It was low and dirty, mixing with humidity until visibility turned into a cruel blur. The platoon tried to return fire, but they were firing at shadows that weren't obligated to be there anymore. The enemy had chosen the ground with patience, and now the ground belonged to them. Mercer dropped prone behind a root tangle and watched the point squad get pinned in a shallow depression that offered no cover from above, only the illusion of safety. The radio operator, a kid named Tully, crawled to a tree to get a signal out, and a round snapped close enough to make him jerk backward like the forest had slapped him. He kept trying anyway, fingertips white on the handset. Lieutenant Arnett got low beside him and shouted coordinates, trying to push them up the chain, but the radio spat static like it was laughing. A machine gun hammered again from the right, and bark splintered off a trunk inches from Arnett's face. Arnett flinched, then forced his head back up, and that's when a single shot, one clean, ugly crack, made him sag as if his spine had been unplugged. He didn't fall dramatically. He folded into the mud, eyes open, mouth trying to argue with what had happened. The platoon froze for a fraction of time that felt endless, because a leader going down in an ambush doesn't just remove a rank, it removes rhythm. The platoon sergeant Vance crawled toward Arnett, and Monroe the medic crawled toward Vance because that's what medics did, move toward the worst place with hands that tried not to shake. Mercer watched it all and felt something cold settle behind his ribs. The platoon was about to become a collection of separate men reacting separately, and that was how you died in Vietnam. Then the M60 gunner fired a long burst to buy breathing room, and the barrel's roar cut through the chaos, like a rope thrown to drowning men. The burst forced the enemy fire to pause, not because it ended, but because even attackers respected a weapon that could reach them through leaves. In that pause, Mercer saw the problem with clarity. The ambush wasn't meant to kill them all at once. It was meant to lock them in place until night made rescue impossible. He saw Tully's radio antenna bent awkwardly and realized the signal wasn't just weak, it was broken. He saw Lieutenant Arnett's map case half open in the mud and realized nobody else had the grid marked the way Arnett had. He saw the platoon's left flank beginning to drift without coordination, and he knew drift became separation, and separation became bodies found later with no story attached. Someone near him hissed, "Where's Mercer?" Not because they needed him, but because in their minds he was an extra piece that might already be gone. Mercer didn't answer. He crawled, low and slow, under the snap of rounds, toward the radio operator, because the radio was the only way out that didn't involve crawling through a kill lane. Tully looked at him like he'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing?" Tully whispered, face wet with rain, sweat, and fear. Mercer wiped mud from the handset and listened to the static, not as noise but as a problem with parts. Back in the motor pool, he'd learned the kind of quiet focus that came from fixing things under pressure, because if you fixed them wrong, a convoy didn't move. Here, if he fixed it wrong, men didn't move. The jungle thundered again with gunfire, and Mercer thought of the way the platoon had written him off, weak, useless, dead weight, and felt a strange relief in it. If everyone expected nothing from him, then he couldn't disappoint them with the only thing he had left, stubbornness. He leaned into Tully's ear and said, as calmly as he could, "Give me the spare wire." Tully blinked. "What?" Mercer nodded toward the commo pouch. "The wire, the one for the handset." Another burst snapped overhead. Mercer didn't flinch. He was already somewhere else mentally, measuring the problem, building a solution from whatever was in reach. He took the bent antenna, forced it straighter, stripped insulation with his teeth and started making the radio into something that could be heard, because the alternative was waiting for darkness to finish what the ambush started. Mercer's hands didn't stop shaking because he was brave. They stopped shaking because he gave them a job. He wrapped the stripped wire around the damaged base of the antenna, ran the length up along a branch, and used the branch like a crude mast, buying height inch by inch. He pressed the handset to his ear again and heard the static thin out, just enough to recognize a human voice somewhere behind it. Faint, irritated, distant, but real. It was a company relay. Not close, not clear, but it was proof the world still existed beyond this patch of jungle. Lieutenant Arnett was half conscious now, face pale. Monroe compressing a bandage with mud-slick fingers. Platoon Sergeant Vance hovered over them, eyes hard, jaw clenched, trying to be a man who could make decisions while the forest tried to erase him. Vance looked at Mercer, and in his expression Mercer saw the same doubt everyone had carried about him, but now it came mixed with something else. Need. Mercer leaned close and said, "I can raise them, but I need a grid." Vance stared. "The LT had it." Mercer nodded toward Arnett's map case. "Then we use that, quick." Vance hesitated only a second because hesitation was the only luxury leaders got, then crawled through the mud and yanked the map case open. Paper stuck to wet plastic, pencil marks blurred at the edges. But the grid reference was there, circled with a shaky hand, and Mercer copied it into his head the way he'd memorized serial numbers on engines. He brought the handset back and spoke into it with a steadiness he didn't feel. "Mayday, mayday, this is Echo 2-6. Platoon in contact, grid follows." He gave it, slow and clear. A crackle, then finally, a voice. "Say again, Echo 2-6. You're weak." Mercer swallowed. "Platoon in contact," he repeated. "Multiple wounded. Leader down. Need immediate support." The response came sharper now, alert. "Echo 2-6 copy. Mark smoke when able. Stand by for fires." Vance leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You get artillery?" Mercer didn't promise. "I got ears." The enemy fire surged again like they sensed the radio had woken up. Rounds snapped into the trees above them. Leaves shredded and fell like green confetti. The M60 gunner yelled for ammo, voice rising with strain. Vance shouted for controlled fire, for short bursts, for spacing, for anything that kept panic from winning. Mercer crawled to a slightly higher pocket behind a stump, keeping the antenna up, and waited for the next transmission. It came. "Echo 2-6, adjust incoming. Danger close. Confirm." Danger close meant the difference between rescue and disaster was wind and math. Vance's eyes flicked to Mercer. "Can you adjust?" Mercer's mouth went dry. He had never called for fire in his life, but he had watched others do it. He had listened. He had learned the shape of those words. "Confirm," Mercer said into the handset, voice tight. "Danger close confirmed." Then the jungle changed. Not instantly, not magically, But the enemy's confidence faltered in small ways when they realized the Americans weren't trapped in silence anymore. The first rounds landed somewhere uphill, thumps you felt more than heard, and then the correction came. Left 2-0, add 5-0. Mercer repeated it, hands gripping the handset so hard his knuckles ached. Vance nodded, relaying the correction as if Mercer were simply a mouthpiece. But Mercer knew the truth. If he messed this up, the platoon would die by friendly fire or enemy fire, and either way, the jungle would keep the bodies. The next volley walked closer, impacting with brutal force that made the ground jump. Dirt and leaves burst upward. The smell of explosive and wet earth flooded the air. The enemy fire shifted, not stopping but sliding away from the worst impacts. The machine gun on the right stuttered, then resumed farther back, no longer perfectly placed. It was enough. Vance saw the opening and did what good sergeants did. He turned a crack into a door. "Move the wounded," he barked. "Peel left. Slow. Keep firing." Monroe and two men lifted Arnett awkwardly, praying the movement didn't tear something worse. The platoon began to peel out of the kill lane in short, ugly bounds, men covering each other, dragging their own fear like extra gear. Mercer stayed on the radio calling adjustments, repeating grids, acting like a bridge between the platoon and the larger war that didn't know they were about to vanish. Then, through the haze and the chop of artillery, a new sound approached. Rotors, distant at first, then growing until it drowned even the gunfire. "Gunships inbound," the radio voice barked. Mercer looked up through the canopy and saw nothing but moving leaves, but the sound alone gave the men something they hadn't had in an hour. Time. The enemy tried to rush the flank as the platoon moved because they understood extraction windows. A group of shadows pushed through the brush at close range, and Mercer fired without thinking, short, controlled bursts like he'd been taught, not aiming for heroics, aiming to stop motion that would kill his friends. He saw one of his rounds kick up bark near a figure's shoulder, and the figure dropped back, not necessarily hit, but discouraged. Vance's eyes snapped to Mercer for a split second, surprised not at the shooting, but at the fact Mercer was still present, still functioning. The Huey's rotor wash hit the clearing ahead before the aircraft itself appeared, bending grass and whipping mist into a spinning veil. But the clearing was too small, too hot, and the enemy knew it. Fire cracked into the open space the helicopter needed. The pilot flared, hovered, then pulled back, unwilling to become a sitting target. "No landing," the radio voice said. "Too hot." Vance swore. Men groaned. Monroe's hands steadied on Arnett's bandage as if brute will could keep the lieutenant alive. Mercer listened to the radio and realized what the platoon hadn't said out loud yet. If the Huey couldn't land, the platoon would have to move the wounded farther, deeper, toward a better LZ, and every meter would be paid for in blood and exhaustion. The jungle wasn't done. Night was coming. The enemy was still there. And the soldier everyone had written off, the motor pool replacement with the shaky hands, was now the only reason the platoon still had a voice loud enough to be heard. By the time dusk bled into the canopy, the platoon had become a moving problem, not a fighting force. They carried their wounded in shifts, arms burning, shoulders cramping, boots sucking at mud with every step. Lieutenant Arnett drifted in and out of consciousness, eyes unfocused, lips trying to form words that never arrived. Monroe kept checking the bandage, checking pupils, checking pulse, as if repetition could hold the line between living and dying. Platoon Sergeant Vance chose a direction not because he loved it, but because indecision was worse. He wanted high ground for signal and a clearing for extraction, but in Vietnam those things didn't wait politely where you needed them. The enemy probed behind them, not charging, not wasting men, just pressing enough to keep the Americans moving faster than they should and firing more than they could afford. The jungle made every sound uncertain. A twig snap could be a monkey, or it could be a man with intent, and the difference mattered less than the doubt. Mercer stayed near the center now because Vance had made a quiet tactical choice. The radio mattered more than reputation. The men who used to ignore Mercer now glanced at him with a new kind of awareness, not admiration yet, but recognition that the platoon's lifeline was wrapped around his chest in a canvas harness. The PRC-25 battery was heavy, the handset slick with grime, and the improvised antenna wire kept snagging on branches. Mercer hated that wire and loved it, because it was the only reason the static ever broke. They moved through a shallow ravine where the air smelled of stagnant water and rot, then climbed toward a ridge that looked promising on the map, but cruel in reality. Steep, slick, and lined with roots that turned climbing into crawling. Halfway up, enemy fire cracked again, closer than before. Not a full ambush, just a quick hammering burst to force heads down and feet to stop. Vance hissed for the platoon to spread, to use trees, to keep moving. But one of the litter teams slipped, and the wounded man they carried, Private Kelso, hit in the leg earlier, cried out in a high, involuntary sound that cut through the jungle like a flare. The enemy answered with more fire, and for a moment, Mercer thought the ridge would become their grave. Then he heard the radio squawk. Echo 2-6, this is Redleg. We have limited illumination available. Say your status. Mercer exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a year. He keyed the handset. We're moving, he said. We need a cold LZ at first light. We have multiple wounded. Leader, critical. Copy, Redleg replied. Recommend you hold high ground and mark at dawn. Gunships can cover if weather holds. Weather, always weather. Fog and rain could erase aircraft as effectively as enemy fire. Vance leaned close. Can you get us smoke at first light? Mercer nodded. If they can see it. Vance looked out into the darkening green. Then we survived the night. A night in the jungle was not simply darkness, it was a different war. Vision narrowed, sound expanded, and fear found space to grow. The platoon dug into a rough perimeter near the ridgetop. Not a perfect circle, but a desperate arc shaped by terrain. Claymores went out if they had them. Sectors were assigned in voices kept low. Monroe kept working by feel. Men drank water like it was medicine. Mercer crouched under a poncho, trying to keep the radio dry, listening to distant chatter that meant other units existed somewhere under the same sky. Around midnight, the enemy tested them. Brief movement in the brush, a few shots, then silence again, as if the jungle wanted to remind them it could reach in whenever it chose. One of the younger soldiers started whispering prayers. Another started talking about home in a rambling voice that made no sense. Vance moved along the line and spoke to each man like a father who couldn't afford softness. When he reached Mercer, he paused. You okay? Vance asked quietly. It was the first time anyone had asked Mercer that all deployment. Mercer swallowed. I'm here, he said. Vance studied him for a second, then nodded as if he'd made a decision about who Mercer was. Later, near the darkest part of the night, Monroe crawled to Mercer and whispered, if the LT doesn't make it. He didn't finish. Mercer understood anyway. The lieutenant's absence would become paperwork. The platoon's story would become a paragraph in an after-action report. Men's fear would become a statistic nobody could feel. Mercer looked out into the black tree line and felt a quiet anger at that kind of erasure. If you've ever heard a family member talk about Vietnam with long pauses, if you've ever realized the story is thicker than what they're willing to say, then you know what Mercer felt right then. So that surviving isn't the same as being saved. In the middle of the night, a soldier on watch hissed that he saw movement. Mercer listened, tried to separate imagination from evidence. A faint scrape, a soft rustle, then the unmistakable click of something metallic. Trip, someone whispered. Tripwire, grenade, a booby trap being set, or a claymore being tampered with. Mercer's mind snapped into the motor pool again. Identify the sound, locate the source, stop the failure before it cascades. He crawled toward the noise, belly in mud, careful not to silhouette against any sliver of sky. He found the edge of their perimeter where a sapling had been bent, unnatural, and he saw a dark shape near the ground, hands working. Mercer didn't shout. He didn't freeze. He aimed and fired a short burst, controlled, close enough that the muzzle flash lit wet leaves like a camera. The shape jerked back and vanished into darkness. The perimeter erupted into alert fire, but Vance snapped them down fast. No spraying, no panic. The enemy had wanted them to waste ammo and reveal positions. Mercer's heart hammered, but his hands stayed steady. Vance crawled to him and whispered, "You see him." Mercer shook his head. "I heard him," he said. Vance looked at him like that was somehow more impressive. The rest of the night stretched and tightened, hour by hour, until dawn began to seep into the canopy. Men who had been written off by their own platoon rarely got redemption in clean cinematic shots. But as the light returned, Mercer's improvised antenna still held, the radio still spoke, and the platoon's thin line of survival still existed, because the man everyone expected to fail had become the quiet center that refused to break. Dawn finally arrived like a reluctant witness, turning the ridge from black to gray to a damp, bruised green. The air was cooler for a moment, mist curling between trees, and every man in the platoon looked older than he had the day before. Lieutenant Arnett was still alive, but barely, breathing shallow, face drawn tight as if his body was arguing with itself. Monroe checked him, then looked at Vance and didn't need to speak. The medic's eyes said time was running out. Vance crawled to Mercer and pointed toward a narrow saddle where the vegetation thinned. "That's our best shot," Vance said. "Can you get them to see us?" Mercer gripped the handset. "I'll try." He raised the antenna higher along a branch, keyed the radio, and spoke into it with an authority that still surprised him. "Echo 2-6 to any station. We have marked high ground, requesting extraction at first light. Grid follows." A crackle, then the reply, clearer now. "Echo 2-6, copy. Aircraft inbound. 2 slicks with escort. Mark with smoke on call." Mercer looked at Vance. Vance nodded once, like a judge declaring a sentence. The platoon began moving the wounded toward the saddle, making a crude LZ by cutting brush with bayonets and entrenching tools, hands working fast despite exhaustion. They didn't make it pretty. They made it possible. The escort arrived first, gunships low and threatening, rotors chopping fog into ribbons. Their presence didn't end the danger. It changed the enemy's calculations. The slicks came in behind them, Hueys appearing like grey ghosts through the mist. Mercer popped the smoke on the radio's cue, and a colored plume rose, thick and obvious, against the green. Almost instantly, enemy fire snapped from below, because the enemy understood what smoke meant. Americans leaving, wounded escaping, victory slipping. The first Huey flared into the saddle, skids touching mud, crew chief already leaning out, screaming for casualties. The platoon surged forward, lifting Arnett and Kelso, half running, half stumbling, trying not to bunch up into a target. Gunship rockets cracked overhead, not close enough to terrify the platoon, but close enough to remind them the sky could kill too. Mercer stayed slightly back, firing in short bursts at muzzle flashes and movement that looked like flanking intent. He wasn't counting, wasn't trying to be a legend. He was doing what Vance had taught the platoon to do under pressure. Keep the next 10 seconds survivable, so the 10 after that can exist. The first wounded went up. The Huey lifted, wobbling under weight, and banked away as rounds snapped through the space it had occupied. The second Huey flared in, more hesitant now because the enemy fire was searching for the pilot's nerves. The crew chief yelled, "Last load!" Not because it was last in theory, but because the helicopter couldn't sit here long enough to be generous. Men shoved the remaining wounded forward. Monroe climbed in with Arnett, refusing to let him go alone. Vance grabbed Kelso and hauled him toward the skid, while another soldier pushed from behind. Kelso cried out, teeth clenched, but he moved. Then a burst of fire hit close enough that dirt jumped around the landing skid, and the pilot began lifting early, panic creeping into the aircraft's motion. Vance shouted, "Wait!" The crew chief reached down, grabbed Kelso's vest, and yanked hard. Kelso's boots left the mud, and he vanished into the cabin. The Huey rose and started to pull away. Vance turned, eyes scanning. He counted fast, too fast, because counting under fire always felt like gambling. "We're missing 2!" someone yelled. Vance's head snapped toward the rear. 2 men were still downslope near the tree line, one dragging the other, both stumbling like their legs had forgotten the agreement to function. The Huey was already moving. The crew chief screamed that they had to go. Vance looked at Mercer, and Mercer understood what that look meant. A decision that would either save someone or create more bodies. Mercer didn't wait for orders. He sprinted down the muddy slope, rifle bouncing, heart slamming against ribs, and reached the 2 men just as enemy fire cracked through the brush above them. One of the men, Private Stiles, had blood on his sleeve and a stunned expression that said he was more afraid of being left than of being shot. The other, Dwyer, had taken a hit to the shoulder and was fighting to stay upright. Mercer hooked Dwyer's good arm over his own neck and hauled. Dwyer's weight was real, punishing, and Mercer felt his legs threaten to quit. Behind them, the jungle snapped with shots. The gunships fired again, trying to suppress, but suppression wasn't a wall. It was a moment. Mercer dragged Dwyer up the slope in awkward, heavy steps, slipping twice, catching himself on roots, refusing to fall because falling would become stopping, and stopping would become dying. Stiles pushed from behind, sobbing something that wasn't words. The Huey hovered above the saddle, pilot undecided, crew chief screaming, rotor wash flattening brush and turning smoke into a violent swirl. Vance stood at the edge, arm windmilling, shouting at the pilot to hold, to hold, to hold. Mercer reached the skid, and hands grabbed them. Vance's hands, the crew chief's hands, someone else's hands, and for a second, Mercer felt the pure, brutal truth of infantry survival. You live because other men pull you when your legs won't. Dwyer was hauled in first. Stiles scrambled. Mercer shoved upward, felt the cabin floor under his knee, then rolled inside as the Huey lifted hard and banked away. Rounds snapped beneath them, tearing leaves, useless now against altitude. The ridge dropped away like a nightmare, losing its grip. Inside the cabin there was no cheering. Men stared at each other in silence, faces streaked with filth and relief, and something darker, the knowledge of how close they'd come to being erased. Vance sat with his back against the bulkhead, eyes closed, breathing like he'd run a marathon in armor. Monroe leaned over Arnett, still working, refusing to let the story end on his watch. Mercer sat opposite them, shaking now that the job was done, hands finally allowed to react. The crew chief looked at Mercer, then away, then back again, as if he was reconstructing who this soldier was supposed to be. Back at base later, the debrief would try to turn the last 24 hours into clean sentences. Someone would ask who fixed the radio. Someone would ask who called the adjustments. Vance would answer with the plain truth. Specialist Mercer did. The captain taking notes would look up, surprised, because Mercer's file likely didn't say, "Saves platoon." The men in the platoon would remember it differently, not as a single heroic act, but as a chain of choices under pressure. Keeping the radio alive, refusing to lose the grid, holding fire instead of panicking, dragging the last 2 men when the helicopter was already leaving. The soldier, everyone wrote off, didn't become a superhero. He became something rarer and more believable, a man who found a way to be useful when usefulness mattered more than reputation. If you're building this channel to preserve stories like that, the remembered lesson isn't that war makes legends, it's that war reveals who refuses to quit when quitting would be easier, and sometimes the one everybody underestimates is the only one still thinking clearly enough to keep others alive.